Today, we'll truth out the DFA daily to the 18th of June 2020. Hello again, I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, world latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today we look behind the scenes at the RBA as they worry about home prices, examine investment property stress, which is rising, and look at which electorates are being hit hardest by COVID in terms of payroll, plus the latest ABS stats, all important data to grasp what is really going on beyond the political spin and half-truths. First, the ABC reports that Reserve Bank economists considered urging the federal government to shut down the real estate industry, pausing sales of established homes to avoid perceptions of a coronavirus-inspired housing market crash. The RBA reports on the deteriorating situation in construction may have influenced the announcement of the government's Home Builder Program documents from inside Australia's central bank, including many marked highly restricted shows, and it also suggests that home prices could slump by up to 15%. The internal reports contradict a much rosier public view the Reserve Bank of Australia has been displaying about the billions of dollars and millions of jobs tied up in housing, construction and real estate. Minutes of the board's May 5th meeting, released publicly, noted demand for both new and established housing had fallen, and falling incomes, confidence and population growth were expected to affect demand for new housing for an extended period. But inside the RBA, which sets key interest rates and economic direction, the warnings were clearer and more severe. It's become clear that there has been a big drop-off in demand for new housing, said speaking notes for Assistant Governor Economic Lucy Ellis, which were obtained through a Freedom of Information request. Beyond difficulties in inspecting and selling houses, people were worried about job security. Contracts are being cancelled. Early-stage buyer interest is very weak and the pipeline is emptying, it noted. Anything that hadn't already been started has been deferred. A day earlier, there were more stern warnings in a COVID-19 liaison message update. Demand for new housing has declined substantially since mid-March and is expected to decrease further, it read, with sharp falls in sales, inquiries and foot traffic and increases in contract cancellation rates. A sharp fall in house prices is predicted in a note marked highly restricted and created on April the 18th. Housing prices are expected to decline by around 7% over the next year, and prices are expected to remain around 10% lower than the February statement over the forecast horizon, it read, putting most of this down to a loss of confidence because of COVID-19. The overall security of the banking sector and its ability to weather some mortgage failure will mitigate larger declines in prices caused by forced sales and financial stress, it said. And the fall in house prices could be as little as 2% on the best scenario. In the downside, the worst scenario, prices fall by 15%. In April, economist Nick Garvin wrote to colleagues warning them the RBA should stop discussing the housing market as if it were operating normally and calling for a halt, as happened to stock market trading in emergencies. I think it's dangerous for regulators to be reporting on housing prices as though the market is currently functioning, he wrote. I suggest we classify the market as paused and treat the prices observed before the pause as the current prices, like how equity markets operate, but on a larger scale. The pause would not mean there was no activity, he wrote, although it could indeed be wise to recommend that the government temporarily halt all sales of established dwellings. Shutting down real estate sales would send a statement that we're in a different category of situation and that normal reporting of clearance rates and average prices was misleading. Even without shutting all sales, pausing reporting on the market would be a fair classification because real estate agents could not work normally. If people start mistakenly thinking that we're experiencing a housing market crash, it's not going to help things, he added. and the RBA's reports on the deteriorating situation in construction may have influenced the announcement of the government's Home Builder Programme, which was announced in early June. In an April report marked highly restricted, the Reserve Bank warned the industry was staring at a cliff. Although some builders and developers have sufficient work for the next 4 to 6 months, the weakness in demand for new housing and the potential deterioration of financing conditions pose downside risks for future activity, it said. In Melbourne, some of the RBA's contacts have seen new home sales drop by half. And by May, things were worse. Builders of detached housing expect weak demand to weigh on construction activity and cash flow beyond their current pipeline, around 4 to 9 months. Builders and developers report that domestic banks and non-bank financiers have become more conservative in their lending. Most firms intend to defer or cancel investment. Many firms have reduced staff hours worked, more so than headcount, and an increasing number of firms expect to implement a wage freeze in the year ahead. SQM research founder Lou Christopher said the documents showed the depth of concern the bank held about the real estate market and the huge number of workers employed in constructing new housing. Clearly, the RBA was very worried about the housing market at the beginning of April, he said. Their concerns may have been the prompt for the federal government to offer recent grants on new housing, as the steep falls in dwelling investments was their primary concern. The scheme was announced on June the 3rd. In May, Australia's largest bank warned house prices could fall 32%, quote, in a prolonged downturn. And the Commonwealth Bank, which holds more Australian mortgages than any other, warned that under a worst-case scenario, house prices would fall by almost a third from their March 2020 peak over the next 3 years. House prices were lower in May, according to research firm CoreLogic, ahead of larger concerns with mortgage pausing, the temporary halt of payments ending in September. National house prices fell just an average of 0.4%, but there was a significant variation across the regions. And payments on more than 1 in 14 mortgages in Australia are currently paused by the major banks. The Australian Banking Association revealed repayments on 429,000 mortgages worth $153.5 billion had been put on hold so far. And the AFR featured my data in perfect storm of high vacancy, falling rents hurt investors. Soaring vacancies and widespread rental discounting have squeezed investors' cash flows to the extent that almost 2 in every 5 landlords are in a position of financial stress. The closure of Australia's international borders in March that cut demand from tourists and international students has put CBD rentals under pressure and triggered a surge in vacancies, particularly in the Sydney and Brisbane CBDs during April and May. Competition with tenants has further intensified as short-stay landlords switch properties into the long-term rental market, leading to a situation in which the owners of 820,000 rental properties were stressed and an additional 123,000 were severely stressed. Analysis by Digital Finance Analytics for the Australian Financial Review shows. We're now being forced to cut our rents by at least $100 a week, said Brisbane-based investor Lisa Liang. One of the 3 international students renting my South Bank apartment went back to China, and now she couldn't return. The remaining tenants could not afford the rent, so my property manager told us to cut our rents. It's putting Miss Liang's investments at risk, but we're paying $6,500 in body corporate fees each year on top of everything else. So if I'm getting less rent and still paying all those costs, then it's going to be difficult to hold this rental, she said. A property is considered to be in stress for its landlord when it has been vacant for more than 2 months and rental incomes are insufficient to cover running costs, according to DFA. Units and apartments are 1.5 times more likely to be stressed than houses, while rentals brought within the last 3 years were twice as likely to be stressed. If a landlord has indicated a wish to sell because of stress and financial pressures, or if the property's value is now lower than the mortgage, then the investor is in financial stress. Digital finance analyst principal Martin North said, quite often there are multiple red flags on a single property, although any one of these is enough to signal stress, whereas if there are several warning signs, then the investor is severely stressed. The high degree of stress was surprising given the current low borrowing cost. He said, I've never seen this level of investor stress in the past. It's a perfect storm thanks to COVID-19, the previous massive run-up in investment properties, falls in rental income, the collapse of Airbnb demand, and no inward migration. The areas of the highest proportion of stressed investors were all in the apartment-dominated Sydney and Melbourne CBDs, areas where there were also large volumes of Airbnb rentals. More than 8 in 10 investors in Sydney's Rushcutters Bay and Ultimo were stressed, with 1,377 severely stressed, and in the Melbourne CBD and Western Melbourne, more than 3 out of 4 landlords were stressed, with 1,918 investors under severe stress. While apartment rentals were weak, a total investor wipeout was unlikely. AMP Capital Chief Economist Shane Oliver said, investors are unlikely to default en masse as they can opt to freeze their mortgage repayments, Dr. Oliver said, but the risks are still there. The lower interest rate helps, but if you're not getting any rent, or if you've taken a big hit on the rents, then it's quite possible that the lower interest rates aren't enough to keep you afloat. Ms. Liang said that she wanted to sell her South Bank apartment, but could not, because it had already shed $20,000 in value since she purchased it back in 2014. I'm happy to sell it for the same amount I paid then, and even take a small loss, but I'm not confident I can find a buyer in today's market. Another apartment she bought in Hamilton 6 years ago had lost $100,000 in value, she said. So given all these issues, I will not invest in apartments ever again. I'd be lucky if I get back the $1 million I paid for these 2 apartments. CoreLogic's Pain and Gain report in April showed that units were about twice as likely to sell at a loss relative to houses due to oversupply, which puts downward pressure on rental yields and prices. And this was acute in Brisbane, where the proportion of apartments sold for a loss was 30.6 percentage points higher than for houses. Now, I'm going to share more detailed analysis of the investor sector in a later post. Yesterday, the ABS released new data on payroll. The Grattan blog analysed the results. Previously hard-hit rural electorates in Queensland and New South Wales with large tourism industries have regained some jobs, while many urban electorates are now among the hardest hit. Their previous analysis of job losses to mid-April showed that rural electorates, particularly those in Queensland and New South Wales with large tourism industries, had lost a greater share of jobs than city electorates. Then 9 of the 10 hardest hit electorates were held by the coalition. Tanya Plibersek's inner city electorate of Sydney was the hardest hit Labor electorate. But now, new data to the 30th of May shows that previously hard hit rural electorates recovered some of their lost jobs through May. For instance, the electorates of Copa and Lyne recovered nearly half of their lost jobs between mid-April and the end of May. The electorates of Fairfax and Fisher, covering the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, also bounced back a bit. In mid-April, they had lost 10.4% of their jobs that they had in mid-March, but by the end of May, that figure had fallen to only 7.6%. Job gains since mid-April have been strongest in hospitality and retail, which regained 7.3% and 3.4% of the jobs lost since the 14th of March. Overall, firms' payrolls to 30th of May showed job losses from COVID-19 had slowed. Total payroll jobs increased by 1% through May, with 7.5% of jobs lost since mid-March, compared with 8.9% in the week ending the 18th of April. Most electorates gained jobs between the 18th of April and the 30th of May. The new data showed that 9 of the 10 hardest hit electorates are now either inner or outer metropolitan. 8 of the 10 top are held by Labour, and the remaining 2 are held by Greens and an independent. The electorates of Melbourne, held by the Greens' Adam Bant, and Sydney, held by the ALP's Tanya Plibersek, are the worst and second worst affected electorates. Many of the hardest hit electorates in urban areas have suffered further job losses since mid-April. One reason is the sharp fall in second jobs, which in part reflects the fact that JobKeeper payments are limited to a single job for an individual employee. People who live in inner-city electorates are more likely to hold multiple jobs, and another explanation of the figures is the shift in job losses towards industries more heavily focused in urban areas. For instance, the information, media and telecommunications sector suffered big job losses between mid-April and the end of May, from 8.5% to 10.5%. And job losses in professional, scientific and technical services also increased over the period from 4% to 4.4%. These second-round job losses may well intensify even as job losses from COVID-19 in sectors directly affected by spatial distancing continue to dissipate as the economy reopens. The worsening story in inner-city electorates also reflects data revisions from the ABS, especially around JobKeeper. For example, the share of jobs lost in the electorate of Sydney were revised from 8.9% to 10.8% for mid-April, and jobs lost in the electorate of Melbourne were revised up to 10.1% from 7.8% previously, and from 7.5% to 9.5% in the inner-city electorate of Wills in Victoria. These data revisions reflect the impact of JobKeeper itself, including expanded coverage of smaller employers through the ATO's single-touch payroll system, since it's the mechanism for delivering JobKeeper payments, as well as other refinements of the ABS approach. And the ABS also released their employment data for May today. Sydney adjusted employment decreased by 227,700 people between April and May. The drop on employment of close to 250,000 people added to the 600,000 in April, bringing the total fall to 835,000 since March. In 2 months, the percentage of people aged 15 and over employed in Australia decreased from around 62.5% to around 58.7%. And the International Labour Organization recently confirmed that government restrictions around COVID-19 should be treated as an appropriate, quote, other reason for people with an attachment to a job to be considered temporarily absent from work. Consistent with this, the ABS has noted that it expects most people in jobs supported by JobKeeper to answer labour force survey questions in a way that will indicate that they are employed based on having a job attachment and also being paid by their employers within an existing employer-employee relationship. In other words, the figures are fudged. Unemployment increased by 85,700 people to 927,600 people, and the unemployment rate increased by 0.7 percentage points to 7.1% from a revised 6.4% in April and from 5.2% in March. As in April, the size of the increase in the unemployment rate in May was reduced by larger than usual numbers of people, both employed and unemployed, leaving the labour force. And this was reflected in a further fall in the participation rate, down 0.7% to 62.9%. The last time the participation rate was below 63% was in January 2001. Monthly hours worked fell 0.7% to be down 10.2% since March, with an April fall revised up to 9.5%. The ABS estimates that a combined group of around 2.3 million people, around 1 in 5 employed people, were affected either by job losses between April and May or had less hours than usual for economic reasons in May. And the underemployment rate decreased by 0.7 percentage points in May to 13.1%, but remained 4.3% above March. The underutilisation rate, which combines the unemployment rate and underemployment rate, rose to a new record high of 20.2%. Unemployment rates increased in all states and territories except for the ACT, which decreased slightly by 0.1 percentage points, down to 4.1%. The largest increases were up 2 percentage points in Western Australia, up to 8.1%, 1.8 percentage points in the Northern Territories, up to 7.4%, 0.9 percentage points in Victoria up to 6.9%, and 0.9 percentage points in Queensland up to 7.9%. And the largest participation rate decrease was 2.3 percentage points in Tasmania, down to 57.3%, followed by 1.2 percentage points in Australian Capital Territory, down to 69.4%, and 0.8 percentage points in Victoria, down to 63.7%. The hours work reduced by 9.5%, which was revised from 9.2% between March and April in season-adjusted terms, which was double the decrease in employed people at 4.7%. After this large fall in April, the decline in hours worked slowed considerably into May, with hours worked reduced by 0.7% between April and May. Whereas in April, there was a much larger decrease in hours worked than employment between April and May, the decrease in employment people at 1.8% exceeded the decrease in hours worked. Women continued to be more adversely affected by the labour market deterioration than men, and younger workers have also been particularly impacted. And by the way, the real unemployment rate is at least 11.3%, and younger working employment is even higher, up in the 20s, but the underutilisation rate, which is probably the only measure of employment that is true, is closer to 20.2%. And also from the ABS today, Australia's population grew by 1.4% during the year ended the 31st December 2019. The population as at that date was 25.5 million people, following an annual increase in 249,800 people. Natural increases accounted for 39.8% of annual population growth, while net overseas migration accounted for the remaining 60.2%. There were 305,800 births and 166,700 deaths registered in Australia during the year. And the natural increase during the year was 139,200 people, a decrease of 5.2% from the previous year, while there were 533,500 overseas migrations arriving and 322,900 departures during the year, resulting in net overseas migration of 210,700 people. Net overseas migration was down 16.5% compared to the previous year. This was due to an increase in overseas migration departures at 14.4%, coupled with a relatively stable set of arrivals at 0.2% decrease. Statistics in this publication largely predate COVID-19, of course. All states and territories except the Northern Territory had positive population growth over the year. Victoria had the largest growth at 1.9%. The Northern Territory had the lowest growth at minus 0.4%. But of course, with locked borders, this will change ahead. As the AFR succinctly put it, population growth heads to zero, housing hit to follow. Australia's population growth is heading to near 0% for the first time since World War I, due to restrictions on migration from COVID-19. Over the 3 months of March, April and May, there were 32,000 more departures than arrivals into the country, excluding tourist movements, with the natural rate of births in Australia at just over 30,000 for a given 3-month period. The population growth rate is now close to zero. As international travel restrictions stay in place, the record low growth will likely continue, reverberating through the economy in areas of housing demand, consumption and skills. And while the Australian Bureau of Statistics cautions against reading too much into the data, suggesting arrivals and departures can be made by the same person and therefore lead to double counting, it still expects very low population growth. It appears likely that population change from net overseas migration will be very, very low, as in order to migrate, people must travel, and the travel numbers are 1 to 2% of normal volumes, the ABS said. Treasury has already forecast that net migration is expected to fall significantly, and last month, Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that a more than 30% decline in net overseas migration was expected this financial year, and an 85% fall was forecast for 2021, compared with the 2018-19 level of 240,000 people. Now, during World War I, there was a negative population growth of minus 0.9% in 1915 to 16 due to soldiers going overseas, and there was another considerable drop during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Demographer Professor Peter McDonald said that while he expected population growth would not hit 0%, the exceptionally low growth in working population due to COVID-19 travel restrictions would hammer the economy. And BIS Oxford Economics Managing Director Robert Mellor said the hit would come via the housing market. Whether it's zero or close to zero, The number has plummeted, Mr. Mellor said, so we are forecasting a drop in migration of around 60,000 this financial year and another 150,000 next financial year, with about 2.7 people per household. The forecast drop equates to around 80,000 fewer homes needed to be built. These people who are no longer coming will impact significantly on the rental market, so it will significantly reduce demand, and that will lift vacancy rates and increase risks around residential property, Mr. Mellor said. And across the ditch, Statistics New Zealand has released its national accounts data for the March quarter, which reported a heavy 1.6% fall in real GDP, the largest fall in 29 years, with per capita GDP crashing 2.2%. Gross domestic product fell 1.6% in the March 2020 quarter, the largest drop in 29 years, as the initial effects of COVID-19 restrictions impacted on economic activity, Stats New Zealand said. This quarter's GDP result shows a widespread drop in economic activity as travel restrictions took hold and the country moved towards lockdown. COVID-19 effects came on top of the smaller impact from drought in some parts of the country. The 1.6 percentage fall surpassed quarterly falls during the global financial crisis in the late 2000s, they said. It's the largest quarterly fall since the 2.4 percentage decline in the March 1991 quarter. In the March 2020 quarter, the Alert Level 4 lockdown saw non-essential business closed, affecting 6 days, 4 weekends, about 7% of the quarter. Industries relating to international travel, such as accommodation and transport, began to feel the effects of COVID-19 earlier in the quarter, with activity dropping significantly once the borders closed on the 19th of March. Service industries contributed the most to the drop in activity, making up almost half of the overall fall in GDP, and the hospitality industry, accommodation, restaurants and bars, was among the most affected industries, falling 7.8% as tourism fell after the border was closed to slow the spread of COVID-19. Household consumption expenditure fell 0.3%. Spending fell on long-lasting products, durables, such as motor vehicles, and a fall in services driven by accommodation, international and domestic air passenger services, and recreational services reflects the drop-off in travel as the pandemic spread. Households could not buy non-essential goods and services as such businesses shut down. A strong increase in spending on short-term life cycle goods offset those falls as households prepared for the lockdown by buying supplies from flour to toilet paper. The different results for consumption of durable and non-durable items showed the changing behaviours of consumers in response to COVID-19. And New Zealand's 1.6% decline in economic activity in the March 2020 quarter compares to a 0.3% fall in Australia. In the same period, there was a 2.1% decline in Canada, a 0.6% decline in Japan, a 2% decline in the United Kingdom, and a 1.3% decline in the United States. A 0.6% increase in the population over the quarter, combined with the fall in GDP to push GDP per capita down 2.2 percentage points in the March 2020 quarter. And annual growth in GDP per capita fell 0.2% in the year to March 2020, down from growth of 1.5% in the year to March 2019. And finally, from the conversation, some advice about renovating or not. The government's home builder scheme allows certain homeowners to apply for a tax-free grant of $25,000 if they're spending between $150,000 and $750,000 renovating a home or building a new home. Eligibility criteria are strict. The scheme has boosted renovation talk in some circles, although, as CoreLogic has pointed out, it may merely bring forward works that were already planned. Here are some questions to ask yourself when trying to decide between renovating and moving, and how to add value to your existing home. Property market observers advise updating or renewing bathrooms or kitchens. Even small fixes such as replacing a cracked or dated splashback, replacing a bath or adding skylights can go a long way. Think about easy repairs that create an invaluable good first impression, a fix-up fence, a new carpet or resurfaced flooring, or even good old decluttering. But remember, you'll only qualify for home builder if you plan to spend at least $150,000 on an owner-occupied home worth no more than $1.5 million. And there are some questions you should ask yourself. How long till you retire? How secure is your employment? Thinking carefully about your earning potential between now and retirement will help you understand what you can borrow and afford. If you are planning to stay, you will get the benefit and enjoyment of the renovations. Do you need to stay close to school or work? If that's a consideration, renovating may be worth more to you than buying further out. Look closely at what your property is worth. There are plenty of online calculators available, and keep track of how much similar local properties with one extra bedroom or bathroom sell for. That will give you a sense of the value add to your home equity that a renovation might represent. Be honest with yourself about the total cost of renovation. There are a myriad of expenses not always included initially. For example, this may include planning fees, the cost of getting a development assessed by council, the cost of architectural drawings, consultants' fees for environmental impact statements or arborist reports, extra costs due to a heritage listing, renting if it's not possible to live at home during renovation, the cost of protecting underground public assets such as water or sewage pipes, and extra costs caused by poor access or other limitations. Consider the possible long-term savings of retrofitting your home to be more energy efficient. Proper insulation, secondary glazing, drought excluders, and solar PV energy are expensive up front, but will save on long-term running costs. It's likely, as energy costs increase, homes that are at least partially off-grid will be more attractive and valuable over time. And remember that for some, even with help from home builder, renovation won't stack up economically. Some older people may eschew home renovation to put money aside to help children get a foot on the property ladder. Others may decide potentially expensive renovation is worth it to hold onto a family home to which children return as they get older. It might sound sentimental, but the idea of Christmas in the family homestead is worth it for some. And there's a range of tax considerations. Find out what tax breaks, if any, you might be eligible for if you renovate to divide the family home into a smaller space, if you're keen to downsize or enhance the accessibility of your home, for example, and adding a self-contained granny flat. However, if the granny flat is leased out, this section of the home would be considered income producing. Your main residence is generally exempt from capital gains tax when it comes time to sell, but you may not qualify entirely for this exemption if a section of the property is income producing. And you may also consider remodeling the family home into a duplex and, depending on council planning laws, convert the title into dual occupancy. However, these suggestions may complicate eligibility for the home builder grant, which seems to exclude property investors, although there's no mention of partially converting the main place into a dual occupancy. The best option here, of course, is to seek advice from a tax specialist. And there are factors to consider if you're thinking of selling up and buying elsewhere. Use a stamp duty calculator and cost of selling calculator to get a rough idea of those costs. How important, you might ask yourself, is proximity to work, particularly if the coronavirus pandemic has opened your eyes or your employer's eyes to working remotely. Would you consider a move to a more remote area where you can afford a bigger house? Chat with a range of real estate agents and get into the habit of reading market media coverage. Have a sense of what houses sell for that feature your desired attributes, such as more bedrooms or off-street parking. And the writer said, as a chartered building surveyor, I'd advise would-be downsiders to be cautious when buying a brand new high-rise apartment due to risks of potentially costly defects that might become apparent over time. And remember, even if you do sell and buy a new place, very few are able to find the perfect home. You may decide to make renovations anyway. So there are no easy answers. It could come down to your individual circumstances, your attitude to risk, and ensuring you have a good grasp of the relative costs of each option. So talk to a financial advisor, tax accountant, real estate agents, builders, architects, and others who've been through each process about what they do differently next time. So in conclusion, it's clear to me that the property sector is continuing to wobble, and therefore making those decisions about investing, making those decisions about renovating, or even buying or selling is extremely complicated at the moment. And I think there's probably some good advice here, which is really to wait, watch, and be very cautious, simply because the broader economic context looks to me to be deteriorating. I expect unemployment to stay high for the next couple of years. I expect home prices still to fall in my main scenario. And if that is true, then the most important thing is not to rush in and try and grab a so-called bargain today and then live to regret it later. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.